Buenas tardes a todas e
Oh,
todos.
good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to this FAO meeting within the framework of the commemoration of the 75 years anniversary of FAO. Today with me, we've got a panel on food systems and gender transformation for Latin America. With the effects of the COVID and the United Nations at ECLAC, it has been estimated that extreme poverty in our region will increase by 28 million people. If this projection becomes a reality, we will reach around 75 million hungry people, slightly more than 1 in 10 inhabitants of our region. Rural poverty is projected to increase by this year by 24%, and extreme rural poverty by an unprecedented 42%. Over the 10 million rural inhabitants who are projected to fall in extreme poverty and hunger, almost 6 million are women, whose increase will not be sufficient even to purchase a basic food basket. The opportunity lies in improving food systems, which brings together food production, processing, distribution, preparation, and consumption activities. So the greatest challenge of the region is to achieve recovery with transformation of inequality. And it is also implies placing on the agenda issues that lag behind the rural women, such as technification, technologies, and it is important then for us to consider rural women, technification, and digitalization of the means of production. The opportunity to overcome these scenario is to try and have a better food systems, acting on the way that our foods are produced, processed, prepared, and eaten in order for the economic results in these processes to favor the equal rights of women and men in the region, thus enabling sustainable development without leaving anyone behind. I want to highlight that it is women the ones who first reacted in the face of the pandemic reactions. They showed all their resilience, capabilities, and they did not stop given the challenges on the contingency. Their capability of response was tremendous, and their leadership has implied that everyone is looking for the necessary goals in order to have a fair and just society. So in this context, it is the FAO that is inviting us to participate in this event. The objective is to characterize the main gender gaps present in the rural world in Latin America and the Caribbean in the context of the pandemic, and to try and identify the needs that will contribute to have an equal exercise of the rights of men and women. This activity will be disseminated via streaming by FAO and the different channels, Facebook and Twitter, and we will have simultaneous interpretation into English. It'll be moderated by Manuela Covey from the FAO Office for Latin America and the Caribbean. I hope that you will all enjoy this activity, that this will be an appropriate moment for reflection, and that we can all really take advantage of the different presentations delivered by all of these women who have a lot to contribute from their lives, from their experience, and their knowledge on each of these topics. So thank you so much and enjoy today's panel. Manuela, the floor is yours. No, thank you so much, dear Joao. I would like to welcome everybody that are connected from different countries from Latin America and the Caribbean. We're very happy to have these expert panel today to talk about such an important topic on the food systems and gender from the perspective of reactivation with transformation. So before introducing the member of the panels, I just want to make a couple of announcements. The panel will be divided in two stages. During the first stage, I will ask one question to each of the members of the panel, and they will have 6 minutes to respond. I will let you know when you still have 2 minutes left. And then, while this is taking place, we would like to ask the audience to write their questions in the chat window, and we will select them and screen them so that during the second stage we can ask these questions to the members of the panel. And obviously, depending on the time constraints, we will see how long each will have to answer those questions. So, as I was saying, we're very happy to have this panel of experts in these topics that we're going to be addressing in the next 90 minutes. Today we have Catalina Ivanovic, who is a specialist in the gender for FAO Latin America and the Caribbean. She's a social anthropologist and has a master's on gender studies from Universidad de Chile, and also a doctor on gender Universidad Adolfo Alberto Hurtado. She is an expert in public policies and also around food topics. We've also have Carolina Franch Mayolo. She is a social anthropologist, master's in gender studies and culture, and a PhD in social studies from Universidad de Chile. She is currently an academic in the Department of Anthropology from Universidad de Chile, and her lines of research are on topics regarding food and also gender approach and cultural perspective. We also have Maria Clara de Moraes Prata Gaspar from the Observatory from Universidad de Barcelona. She's a doctor in sociology from France, and she's also an expert in food and nutrition, University of Barcelona. She has a master's on applied sciences, and she's got a license on nutrition from the University Center from Brazil. Maria Clara is an associate professor from Social Anthropology, University of Barcelona, and also a member of the Food Observatory. Her investigation is based on the social representation of the body and also the medication process of food, and also the relationship with the socio-cultural behaviors. We also have with us Claudia Brito. She's also we have she's an expert in the evaluation of public policies in nutrition as well as food safety in Chile and the region. Currently, Lorena Rodriguez is also a teacher in public policies group at Universidad de Chile, and she is leading a transdisciplinary group. We have with us today Guadalupe Valdez. She is an economist, former parliament from Dominican Republic, and she's coordinator of the panel called Zero Hunger. And at the Latin America, she between 2011 and 2016, and currently she is a special ambassador for FAO in Latin America and the Caribbean. And lastly, we have Claudia Brito Bruno, a regional officer from FAO, expert in gender and social systems. And she is a teacher in administration specialist in public policies and in the creation, implementation, supervision of programs and projects on economic and social sustainable development, with a special emphasis on actions that favor gender equality. I have therefore introduced all of the members of the panel through that this dialogue we can really delve into the different topics through the questions that I will ask. I want to thank also then Catalina Ivanovic, and I want to start by asking her, what are the main gender gaps that rural and urban women face in Latin America and the Caribbean with regards to production, elaboration, distribution, and access to the food market? So Catalina, please. Well, thank you, Manuela. Good afternoon. And for me, it is a pleasure to be with you here today. I want to greet the other members of the panel that are with me today and also the audience. So, in order to talk about the situation of rural women in Latin America and the Caribbean, it is very important to understand that although the statistics talk about quite an adverse scenario, the what we want to really promote from FAO is not to place them as victims, but rather to acknowledge their capabilities, their knowledge, and as Joao mentioned, also their capabilities when it comes to respond and resilience. In our society, women are usually placed in a position of a vulnerability, but we usually fall short when it comes to highlighting women's capabilities and when having to face challenges. The main gap that the rural women face is poverty. As Joao also mentioned in his introduction, given the pandemic and this scenario, it is at least an increase of 4% of poverty during this year. This has an important impact on rural women, both in their entrepreneurial activities, and it also impacts them because they are in spaces or in areas that are particularly impacted, like, for example, the area of tourism, small scale food production, as well as services. Rural women have less access to productive services and also to state help or subsidies that would allow them to have an income that would set them above the line of poverty. When we talk about the possibility of employment and having steady income that would allow them to have access to a better or dignified quality of life, we see that rural women have higher levels of informality in the way that they actually work. They are highly impacted by the different crises. Poverty is also linked to the lack of food security. We can see that this pandemic has had an important impact on rural women, especially those indigenous and Afro descendant populations. The figures from 2008 said that 29.9% of women were suffering food security issues, moderate or serious level. In the case of men, it was 24%. So this scenario, according to the trends and estimations, would become even more serious in this pandemic context. Women and households led by women are tend to be uh, more subject to these kind of sufferings for either hunger on the one side or obesity, malnutrition on the other. So women in this kind of situation face an overburden of work, which represents no income and which is translated into poverty in time. That is to say, they have an overburden of tasks. They have to take care of the children, of the sick elderly population, and that's why we require better care systems in order to respond to these demands and needs so that we can protect the people who require that help on the one side, but also to safeguard women because they do spend many productive hours working also. And that is quite dramatic in the case of women, in the case of indigenous women. Another important point to mention in this scenario is violence. Women, given the pandemic, have been subject and impacted to domestic violence. The number of statements that have been received has increased, and that's why we require help in order to provide them support. If I were able to summarize this, I would talk about making them invisible, difficulty on behalf of the state and the society to acknowledge the productive role and reproductive role of rural women, and creating real actions, programs, and projects and policies that truly respond to their needs and that can really highlight their skills and abilities. Thank you very much. Thank you, Catalina. Now, I would like to ask Carolina Franchi, what are the main gender gaps that face rural and urban women in Latin America and the Caribbean with regards to the consumption, preparation of food, as well as the waste management? Okay, hello, everybody. I want to greet you all, but let me delve straight into the matter. We have very little time. And I would like to answer your question by saying the first thing. Gender inequality does not benefit anyone, yet it's a fact that we must all address. And here, I'm not only talking about individuals, also about institutions and infrastructure and other organizations, sorry. Although eating is something that all humanity does, there are many people that are not feeding themselves healthy. And this has to do with lack of knowledge on behalf of some individuals, but also the characteristics of the environment in which they are that promotes behaviors that take these individuals into malnutrition with malnutrition habits. The has taken place throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, but especially the ones that we have led in the case of Chile, the people that I've shared with, Catalina and Lorena, we've come to realize that the women in the lower economic segments are the ones that are identified as the population with the most concerning figures, for example, of is one of the examples of malnutrition in the current dates. So that malnutrition is a symptom that just goes to show the vulnerability in terms of access to health and the right of living a dignified and healthy life, in this case, women. Some of the causes, and given the time constraints, I cannot go into detail here, just going to highlight some points that might open up certain scenarios, which are the ones that I want to share or to explore in these few minutes. We need to politically reflect what does this division of role that are allocated to men and women, what does it actually mean? In Latin America and the Caribbean, those gender roles still place women in the household with household chore responsibilities, whereas men are always considered formal work, reproductive, having an income. And Catalina has already mentioned that this means that social security, healthcare, legally is only for one of the genders. And if on top of this, we say that if women do participate in formal employment, they have lower incomes, they have lower support, lower rights, it implies a double or a triple burden, which impacts their diets, their feeding habits. They have a different kind of diet. They have a different pattern that they create and follow. And that means that women give, in a sense, they give up part of their food, give their food so that that food is available to other members of the family. And that the trade-off is done by gender. That is to say, I, as a woman, as a person in charge of my household, I will probably not eat all of the nutrients that I need, and I give them to my children, especially if they are male. So this goes to reinforce the devaluation pattern of their functions, of the role of their gender. And as a paradox, it is women who are in charge of taking care of others, distributing and cooking the food, yet at the same time, they are also the ones that are reproducing this pattern, which does not consider self-care. So by allowing others to eat, then they fall into anemia, malnutrition, etc. So we use Patricia Aguirre as a reference. She's an Argentinian sociologist, which is the neglected women. And basically, it is leaving their food to others. And by doing that, they start losing self-esteem. And if we start looking at this, these women are trapped in a vicious circle, which is a downward spiral, increases their health risk, and decreases their productivity. So the fact that they should have a well-balanced diet has to do with state or government policies that can allow for food safety to be redistributed. And just to close, I would like to say that we have a future challenge. We cannot waste food when there is hunger around the world. I have very little to say about this. I just want to mention it when there's a whole planet that's suffering because of the scarcity of water, air that's being contaminated, soil that's being contaminated. We have to look for policies and we must try to have a more equitable redistribution. And to close, the very last one is something regarding what we have called beautiful food. But the most important thing is that we must eat healthy and not necessarily having that shiny apple. We just need to know that we have to eat well.
Thank you, Carolina, for highlighting the fact that these are not only individual solutions, but also at a state level. So let's move on to the next panelist. We'll ask Maria Clara, what impact is the pandemic having upon corporal aspects and how this accentuates gender biases and social inequalities? Thank you, Manuela. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Marta Ruiz, who has also presented, who has also drawn up this presentation with me, the observatory, the organizers of this event for this invitation. Answering the question then, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have observed in different social processes, for example, Brazil, Mexico, or Spain, a toughening of the um, discrimination in women's body in terms of weight and that kind of thing. So we see that the shape of the body and weight has become accentuated both in the mass media, in social networks, Instagram, Facebook, and so on, but also in the discourse of women themselves. So we have observed in a study conducted by the Observatory of Food during confinement that we have interviewed women of different social cultural backgrounds. And in this study, we have been able to see how this standard implies a kind of very, very important mental burden and involves fears, uncertainties, and so on. And that burden is related to the management of home, um, the feeding of the whole family as well. In fact, this often is promoted as a result of a discourse based on individual responsibility and if preventive practices, and which relies upon women primarily. And this uh, responsibility is promoted as from institutional um, uh, discourses, for example, that which promotes some healthy food during confinement states or focus on a biomedic perspective, and its main objectives are to prevent an increase in weight, obesity, and this perspective, we believe, is not sufficiently considering other aspects of food and nutritional safety, which has to do with social aspects, for example, the increase of hunger vis-a-vis economic conditions. And this uh, has reinforced some gender inequalities and may have negative impacts upon their perceptions, their bodily perceptions, their food practice, and also increases the aspect related to weight. And this is a phenomenon that has social, economic, health, emotional consequences that are extremely important for women primarily. And likewise, the impact of this and within a context of greater weakness becomes even more important when we don't take into consideration the ethnic or social, economic, and cultural differences that exist among women, because it has also been this is something that has been ascertained over the past few months. And therefore, we believe that when we apply a feminist perspective to policies in order to reduce gender inequality, it should help to design more effective strategies within the realm of food. And it also involves, and this type of outlook would break down the category of women. Uh, of woman to talk about women, because in addition to gender, there are social factors such as social class, power, age, economic situation, origin, place of residence, and so on, gives rise to a whole diversity of women with very different realities and with uh, and different oppressions and opportunities as well. So this also has an impact upon the corporal management, and the biggest impact is its impact on male chauvinism that states what we must look like and what we must eat in order to be healthy. But often we have to take into consideration the biosocial differences and differences in terms of opportunities that women suffer from, not only vis-a-vis men, but also among women. For example, when we talk about healthy feeding, uh, healthy food must imply that it must be culturally adequate. And another aspect refers to medical standards associated to uh, body mass index, and this has to take into consideration populations which have very different um, body mass index, and has to take into consideration the biosocial realities. On the other hand, uh, this also is related to access to material resources for healthy feeding and for the maintenance of a weight or of a bodily shape which is considered adequate. In the case of rural areas where women uh, work as from the primary sector and until the stage of consumption, often they don't have access to water or find many difficulties. And in urban contexts, there are some neighborhoods where accessibility to obtain food products is also scarce. There are some food deserts, as we call them. And another example would be access to information. And during the pandemic, this was very important, and yet not all women can gain access to the same level of information, to the same information sources, and to the same education. And therefore, to sum up, we believe that any public policy should be thought, designed, and projected as from the experience of the diversity of women and of their conception as agents for change. Basically, food and nutritional safety must reflect that diversity of experiences, must make women participants in the planning and development of strategies. But above all, it must also cater for the socio-cultural dimension of food, and including all the different spheres in the lives of women. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria Clara, for emphasizing the importance of of all these aspects and of looking at all the dimensions of these issues. Now, we would like to offer the floor to Lorena Rodriguez, and we would like to ask what are the aspects or key dimensions when it comes to the design of policies and programs favoring the development of inclusive food systems in the region? Lorena, you have the floor. Hi, it's a great pleasure to greet you all. Thank you very much for this invitation and for the opportunity of being able to share this information with you. I dare say, having listened to my predecessors, uh, when we spoke about obesity, hunger, climate change, non-transmissible diseases, and COVID-19, that on top of that, we can add the pandemic of inequality, where women are the object or the subject of unjust discrimination. When we observe the diagnosis done by Catalina, Maria Clara, and also the comments by Manuela and Joao and Catalina, we clearly realize that this does not include a single sector, and that it forces us to have an intersectorial perspective and also a transdisciplinary perspective involving different experiences and different knowledge that can become intertwined in order to produce an innovating result in order to resolve these issues. Another aspect that comes to mind immediately is that what we require are policies, programs, strategies, projects, and laws aimed at the determinants or common conductors of these problems, and most of which are structural in nature. The diagnosis is very clear. Sometimes we have to have details related to local geographic relevance or of some specific populations, but the general diagnosis, I believe, is already there. And an issue that seems to be obvious, and probably among those of us here is obvious, is that these inequalities are invisible. And it is important that key actors, key stakeholders such as government entities, both local and national, legislators, academia, civil society, all take this issue on board. One cannot simply deal with an issue which is invisible. Mapping these key stakeholders is also a task in order to call their attention and thus advance towards the measures that we require. We also need strategic alliances, and I believe that events such as these, alliances with UN entities and other international organizations, implies that this becomes a mainstream issue, a global issue, and thus the solution must also be global. We must design and implement policies, programs, strategies that are relevant, have a gender perspective, and probably with a positive discrimination in favor of women as a way of making greater and faster headway towards equality, recognizing, as was mentioned beforehand, its productive, reproductive, and community role. In generic terms, these actions should include a vigorous system of social protection that focuses on women, a set of laws and regulations that ensure labor rights. We already heard people talking about instability or the precarious type of work that many women have, both in terms of productivity and salaries, and among them to eliminate segregation and discrimination, programs that guarantee the access to crucial resources for their productive activities such as land, water, financing, tools, cattle, seeds, and so on. Also training programs for women so that they may grow and make headway in terms of their lives and productive lives. I believe that we also need to have a strong system in place for the care of children, ill, disabled, and old people. That is often a task that women take on board, and we must also promote shared care from discourse to actions. Often we go back to our myths, to our habits, and we make the mistake of again um, providing women or giving women these types of tasks. In this sense, it is also important to explicitly establish within countries' constitutions the right to food. If we're talking about a just, a fair system, the right to adequate, healthy, and pertinent food in socio-cultural terms is a mandate, and many countries in the region have done so. But Chile, for example, doesn't have that in its constitution, and likewise, laws that support or back up this constitutional right and that enable its implementation via plans and programs. These measures must be aimed towards doing away with gender-based inequalities that promote the equality of women, catering for its own needs for maternity and other physiological changes. And thus we need to prioritize structural actions of a legislative fashion, regulatory and also fiscal measures in order to have a proper impact upon the reduction of gender gaps. And we must also strengthen certain programs to protect women that are victims of gender violence and that after the pandemic will imply a major challenge, and we must also abandon the discourse that the development of public policies with a gender perspective are very expensive and that we can thus do away with them. Sustainable development cannot be conceived without the equality among men and women as the only way to become more equitable and resilient societies. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lorena, for highlighting this real pandemic of inequalities, and as well as the role of policies, programs, laws, and rights, the set of rights that must be acknowledged. And that gives us an excellent way to introduce Guadalupe Valdez, who will talk to us about how to contribute, how congressmen and women can contribute to fighting against hunger and malnutrition in Latin America and the Caribbean, developing these legal frameworks with a gender perspective that deal with malnutrition, hunger, and overweight in our countries. Guadalupe, you have the floor.
We can hear you. Okay, thank you so much. And we have just heard in the previous presentations the gender gaps that women, rural and urban women face in Latin America around the Caribbean with regards to production, elaboration, distribution, market access, consumption, preparation, and the waste of food. And Lorena is talking to us about some of the key aspects when it comes to designing programs and policies that favor the development of inclusive food systems in the region. As we know, the mission of the members of parliament includes the positioning of some topics in the public agenda, approving legislations and budgets, really fiscal policies, and their implementation. And therefore, this requires having legal instruments that will allow us to go into demanding the exercise of certain rights. So the members of parliament have to approve public policies and legislations that are effective for the respect, protection, and materialization of the right to healthy eating within the framework of the sustainable development goals, with a multidisciplinary and multinational approach, as has already been mentioned. When we see the contribution of women, we know that they contribute to the food systems and diets according to the biological role, breastfeeding amongst them, and they are responsible also for the care of children, which is an important role in our culture. When we look at most of societies, it is women who decide what's going to be eaten at home. And that is why it is so important to keep in mind that in many territories, women are the ones who are responsible for the production of food. They support, has already been said, an important and uneven work burden when considering the care that takes place within the homes and that represent no incomes. So this requires the creation of legal frameworks. Many of the workers, of the agricultural workers or farmers are women. Their work is really invisible, and this requires that there is specific information for women at every single level of production, consumption, health, nutrition. And for this, we need differentiated statistics. The set of policies to promote the right to an appropriate diet for women goes well beyond just adopting measures or health or access towards health. Sure, these measures are important, but vulnerability and discrimination imply that there are further efforts needed in order to remove all of the discriminatory legislation towards women that come from 100 years ago and that have been created in a paternalistic state. We cannot allow for legal frameworks with a gender perspective that include the triple burden, overweight, malnutrition, public policies, and we need to address access to women to land, to technical assistance, to credits and loans, water and energy. It is therefore important to have a view, a perspective where we need to uh, acknowledge the importance of this non-remunerated work that we do within the households, and that is necessary, and therefore it is necessary to have a redistribution of those taxes in the household, and legal frameworks have to take those needs, and there should be gender sensitive budgets in order to have a better means to have access, for example, to modern stoves, to electricity, to different types of food, recognizing the time that these tasks require. All of these labor related legislations have to do with women's rights and food safety and nutritional safety too. And this also requires reinforcing the participation and the representation of rural women, urban women at every single level when the legal frameworks are created, when public policies are created on food safety and nutritional safety, creating an appropriate environment in order to promote breastfeeding, for example. The members of parliament have the tools to guarantee the human right to food, to have access to food, which also implies defending the rights of women, which would have an effective or a positive effect on the nutritional levels, thanks to the improvements regarding to empowerment and their capabilities. I would like to close by saying that it is important that from the parliaments there should be transformational processes promoted, because women are agents of change. They are also subjects to rights in every single sense of the word. Thank you so much. No, thank you, Guadalupe, for highlighting those legal instruments that we must put together, and also those that we need to do away with. Now let's go to Claudia Brito. I would like to ask Claudia, what are the main challenges and keys when it comes to implementing public policies with a gender perspective for the development of healthy food and sustainable food systems that will contribute to decreasing malnutrition in the region? Claudia, the floor is yours. Well, thank you, Mano. I want to thank all of my colleagues here today, Joao, and everyone in the audience listening to us through the different media within the framework of this 75th anniversary of FAO, as well as World Food Day, and also the recent commemoration of rural women. We were very active there in that campaign, Women and Rights, trying to make all of these issues visible. We're trying to really we're trying to really move forward there. I want to take some of the points mentioned by the different presenters, and I would like to, how can I call this? Maybe we can just put an additional emphasis on this. If we're trying to bring together a state, a country, if we're really talking about a social network, like a social interwoven society, rights of women and the rights of women and food, and also considering these today from FAO, given the important efforts that we're undertaking in trying to understand that everybody has the right to healthy eating, to a healthy diet. I wanted then to go back to some of the things that have been mentioned. The first one, when it comes to the implementation of public policies in the region, is simply saying that there has been quite some progress in the region. I think that is one that has made the best progress when it comes to nutritional food and food safety. There's also been progress made on some of the regulations and legislation regarding have a more comprehensive approach to the situation of the populations that are still in a very uneven and unfavorable conditions. Having said this, by after listening to Guadalupe, who I can realize that in many situations, we have some good political frameworks, yet the implementation falls short. We have to have a more structural view of them because the food system also considers other aspects that have to do with rights that address different topics. For example, the body consumption, and in many situations, these legal frameworks have not been able to appropriately address all of those topics. And also, I think that there is a foundation here that has to do with the coordination between the legislative branch and the executive branch in the different countries when those legislations are designed. Commitments have got to come, the political commitments have got to come from the highest level when it comes to implementation, and also investing, having strong alliances, having new sources of investment, and having budgets for the implementation of public policies that are behind these legislations, behind these initiatives. And also, we have to clearly disseminate what are going to be some of the affirmative actions that we're going to focus on strategically in the short and long term to strengthen the food systems. I believe that these are debates that are still a long way ahead of us, but this afternoon, I think it's important to talk about this. Also, the relevance of the programs is one of the topics that I wanted to talk about. How relevant are they when we analyze the impact and when different programs have overlapping, for example, social protection, and when they become systems and they overlap with the food security programs, climate change, health policies. Also, the coverage of all of these policies, I believe, is one thing that's key. I do not fully agree with what Lorena said because I do believe that we have information, but we need more granular information that we still do not have in Latin America, that can allow us to look in more detail all of these situations that some of the other colleagues have mentioned. Different sectors, the intersectorial approaches with the indigenous people. We have data there that does not allow us to go down to the granularity level that we require. Different sectors, for example, we need to activate private sector as one of the main axes for development, and they have quite a decisive voice when it comes to transforming the situation of diets of food. In FAO, from the regional conferences, we have a mandate. They have said we have three initiatives that we discussed, and one of the clear mandates has to do with working with the private sector, with the enterprises and business sector. And there's just two things that I do want to say. Investing in women's leadership that goes way beyond just them being part of the social presence. We need to go towards parity when it comes to decision-making spaces. We need to evaluate the impact of public policies. Otherwise, we're going to be making mistakes. We have some very good public policies, and with some adjustments and evaluations, we could actually turn them around and make them very positive for the population and the situation of women in our region, and in particular, Afro descendants and rural women. I agree with my colleagues that it is necessary that this region go into a virtuous cycle, upward spiral, with more detailed information of the different populations, especially the ones that are the most vulnerable. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for providing us with so many different elements. We have a few questions as from the audience. We have a little bit around half an hour left. So we can answer in 3 or 4 minutes some of the questions. And I believe that they will be very useful. Let's begin with Catalina. Catalina, what situations explain rural women in the region suffering from overweight and obesity, as well as hunger at the same time? Thank you very much for that question. In all truthfulness, within the region, we need to deal with different expressions of malnutrition in a comprehensive manner. I believe that that is the key aspect to understand that the different types of malnutrition correspond to ways of living, and inequalities have hindered the access of rural, indigenous, and Afro-descendant women to material conditions, and because of that reason, to a type of food that enables them to feed in a healthy fashion. So, in those scenarios where what prevails is a scenario of tremendous poverty, um, very frequently we find hunger and malnourishment in scenarios that are somewhat more mixed in nature, what we have called modern food systems, or on the way towards becoming much more modern, the inflow of the food industry and the presence of food that is very rich in calories, in fat, in salt, for example, and that are not a major contribution in terms of vitamins, for example, means that as a result of their cheap price, they are purchased by women. Likewise, there are social factors that have to do with how women, as was mentioned in this panel, uh, as we women often tend to sacrifice our own care in favor of satisfying the nutritional requirements of the men in our families. And we therefore do not pay sufficient attention to our own realities, to our bodies, and so on. In some research, I have found that women eat standing up, accompanying the family that is sitting down to have dinner, because they position themselves in a situation where they have to care for the rest. And therefore, when we ask them, well, when do you get to eat? How do you obtain food in a healthy fashion? They understand themselves in a secondary position. And that inequality that places women in a situation of greater vulnerability and poverty, favoring at the same time a scenario of intensive maternity, or of a feminine model whereby um, the care of women for themselves is very difficult to make to become visible. In my understanding, means that women in our region are experiencing a very complex and mixed scenario in terms of malnutrition and its different ways of expression. Thank you, Manuela. Thank you, Catalina. Carolina, this issue that has come up, the poverty gap, and especially the time poverty gap that women suffer from. What are some of the recommendations for the development of some policies so that at home healthy food is cooked, considering this factor? Thank you. I think everything is implicit here. Our societies continue to, despite the progress that we have made in legal and terms, that there is still a great inequality at the domestic level, and especially when it comes to food, when men begin to support, in inverted commas, household chores, what is left out is the day-to-day activities of the food system, of catering for feeding a group, not a single person. And in that sense, we have not paid sufficient attention to how much time is spent or consumed in conducting that activity. That activity is not only to open the fridge, or in the case, or opening up um, the food store. This involves going to a street fair. For rural women, it implies having land, irrigation, and so on. So this is an activity that is far more extensive than simply to say that it'll take me 2 minutes to cook something. So states, when they produce public policies, they must know who is responsible for that. for those chores. And those chores are not only, and the idea is not only to remunerate those chores. Um, we cannot simply remunerate care of others. No, I believe it is far more complex than that. Um, uh, this has to do with the time that is spent by some to benefit others, and how spending that time does not imply that they gain access to that benefit. For example, consuming that food. So we must generate a system that deals with a restructuring in the public and private spheres. And that has been very, very complex because we separate what is public from what is private. And the issue of food is something much more cross-cutting, much more horizontal. It is not simply limited to that dichotomy, biological or social, productive or not, as mentioned by the other presenters. What we must see is how we can think of a subsistence, because at the end of the day, and I fully agree with Maria Clara, at the end of the day, I am bothered by the fact that people who talk about obesity or malnutrition is because there is an abnormal body, uh, obese bodies. Uh, are a symptom of poverty and a symptom of the lack of willingness and time benefit in order to obtain healthy food. Consumption not only means obtaining adequate nourishment, but it implies a quality of life, a habitat, which means that in that consumption we have a better um, habitat. And so we must have regulations in terms of uh, uh, working aspects and legal terms. We must think of the right to food, which is much more expansive than it's much more than simply eating something that is nourishing. That is what I wanted to emphasize. Thank you, Carolina. I fully agree with with the fact that the right to food has different components and different perspectives. And you referred to the cultural, age, gender adaptation to that. All those aspects are fundamental. We have a question for Maria Clara. You have mentioned a nutritional scenario that demands from women nutritional and corporal patterns that are difficult for them. So taking into consideration how nutritional education, taking this into consideration, how do we conduct an food education for women and in our communities? Thank you very much for your question. First of all, we cannot simply place bodies in different categories. If we want to establish a public health policy that does not stigmatize specific bodily shapes, or that does not promote um, slim bodies, because often that what that does is to increase the stigmatization of overweight person, and especially of overweight women, because women are far more stigmatized than men as a result of this. So, first of all, I believe that this establishment of categories is very strong within the medical field of what is a normal body and what is an abnormal body. And we must question that. We must question that with interdisciplinary perspectives, for example. I believe that anthropology, sociology, social sciences, in the general terms, can make a great contribution to create a new debate on on what is a normal or abnormal body, and try to understand what underlies the construction of these medical categories. Because what we find at the end of the day is that the medical field is extremely influenced by representations, by social representations, and indeed that is the case when it comes to obesity. For example, there are many studies about this, that there is a phobia towards fatness among health professionals in general. uh, that discourse, basically what it does is to reproduce and promote certain corporal ideals and rejects others. And therefore, we must create new views on how to tackle uh, the body, as from medical discourses involving public policies, of course, because often those health policies are based on medical discourses. And therefore, I believe that we must rethink this and have an interdisciplinary um, perspective is fundamental. A feminist perspective is also important that seeks to understand uh, the way in which the body because it's far more important than women, and also deal with the diversity of bodily shapes among different societies and also among different cultures. I spoke of the body mass index, which is a reference that has been established in some Western countries, but that is imposed upon all countries of the world. There are countries in the world where overweight and obesity has a different meaning, a different significance, a different symbolism, and therefore it's important to consider all aspects, not so much nutritional or medical in nature, but also social, cultural, and symbolic. I don't know if I have answered the question.
Well, thank you so much, Maria Clara. Lorena, we want to now focus in this new context of COVID-19, the pandemic. You also talked about the pandemic of inequality and obesity. But what are three very concrete measures that can be implemented by the different states in order to decrease the level of vulnerability of rural women of falling into the extreme poverty that have been identified as one of the most important gaps when facing the problem of food security? What are three things that could be implemented by the state? So three measures that can be implemented to decrease this vulnerability. Yes, thank you, Manuela. It's only going to take me 30 seconds to respond to what Claudia mentioned when she talked about the diagnosis. I simply have to say that I agree with her. Sure, there are always diagnoses that have not been made and details that we do not quite know. My call is let's not wait for more diagnoses and let's start doing these things in parallel. We already know about many of the things that need to be done. Let's move forward with diagnosis, but let's not just undertake that. And also, let's continue moving forward with some of the things that have already been answered. Now, in answering the question, the participation of the private sector is important because this is an intersectorial problem, and therefore it impacts all the different stakeholders. But the state does have an important role, which is regulating the private sector. Sometimes we cannot always depend on the willingness. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So one of the topics that I think is quite important when answering this question is how do we regulate employment conditions? How can we make some jobs more formal? How do we acknowledge them and how do we give them social protection? When rural women get sick, for example, especially now, for example, in the pandemics, are totally fully exposed because they have no social protection. There is no formality when it comes to their employment, and therefore that is a level of vulnerability that needs to be addressed. Something else that I believe is quite important is the support to leadership, which was also mentioned by Claudia, if I'm not mistaken, and that is that women, if they can get training, that would be wonderful. And that's also part of the role of the state to give them the possibility to develop themselves in whatever task they have decided to work on. And also, that I think is critical to move forward is the care of those where people that are usually taken care of by women, children, elderly people with handicap, or simply people that are ill within the household. This is the double and triple burden that does not allow women to really self-fulfill their lives. Now, when it comes to food, in order to address these issues, and to have a more resilient food systems that are actually able to resist a crisis like the one of COVID or other climate or social crises and disasters like earthquakes or tsunamis. Well, these systems need to have the a response capability, and this means that they need to be well planned in times of peace. Also, the right to food, the right to food in a constitution, the right to to eat laws that can allow for the right to have a good diet, but also nutrition with a perspective that can keep the nutritional aspects considered. For example, legal measures, for example, taxes, subsidies, not only when buying, but also for production. And again, women, the right to water, the right to land, the right to livestock, the right to seeds, also fishing women, artisanal women, artisanal fishing by women is one of the important activities that takes place in Chile. The government must understand that they can provide concrete subsidies, whether it be economical or in kind, for them to carry out their activities. Also, these guilty discourse regarding the body, your body is not nice, we have to move away from those type of discourses, and by now we should stop talking about the choices, it's a right choice or a bad choice. I totally agree with what has said. The discourses of the health teams, not only physicians, but not only health teams, are also some other important leaders in the public policy sector, need to change the wording that they use. And I apologize if I went over the time allocated. No, actually, what you have said is very interesting because you have connected this to a question that is for Guadalupe, and that is, how do we develop laws and public policies that can make it compatible? On the one hand, the empowering of women, rural women, with these care of children, the care of youth and the elderly. How can we empower on the one hand, but not affecting that other activity on the other side? Yes, with the from the parliamentary fronts against Humber, we build legal frameworks, and this has to be seen interdisciplinary and comprehensively in order to improve nutritional results of the food systems that can truly contribute to a world where we can guarantee the right to access to food. It is necessary to increase the percentage of a family income that's under the control of women, so that the general well-being of household can be improved. Literacy, happiness, health. For example, the social protection programs should not penalize women because they are the ones that have to undertake the task of taking the child for a vaccine. It is women that should go to school with the children. These tasks need to be redistributed, co-responsibilities. And for this, it is very important to consider all of that within the legal frameworks, guaranteeing the access of women to markets, to economic resources, to financial resources, improving women's status, transforming the gender roles through actions, capabilities, and self-esteem. And for this, it is also very important to train the decision makers, both at the executive branch as well as the legislative branch, to understand the impact of the legal frameworks, so that the laws are made with a gender perspective, not only language-wise, but also having articles that refer to the rights of women, but also in the whole legal framework comprehensively. This approach needs to be considered. This is a perspective that should guarantee rights. If we do not guarantee women's rights, for example, the right to reproductive and sexual health of women, the right to decide, like what's taking place in the Dominican Republic right now on topic regarding the non-penalization of abortion on three causes, that we have differentiated statistics too, so that we can know the real contribution of women to the national accounts, the value of the non-remunerated work that women do. All of that needs to be considered. Right now, the legislative agenda in order to guarantee food systems that are sustainable and healthy with a gender perspective has got to consider laws like a school diet, family agriculture, uh, public acquisitions and purchases where indigenous people, Afro-descendant women, the right and to land, water, all of that needs to be considered. Water is private. We have a law in the Dominican Republic that is almost along those lines. So if water becomes a private, we are going to be creating a new discrimination to women and towards human beings. Laws need to be laws need to be put together, for example, for food labeling. And all of that has got to be done with a gender perspective, a gender view, interdisciplinary, where no one is discriminated, but in particular, women, as has happened up to now. Well, thank you so much, Guadalupe. We have a question for Claudia, considering this intersectional challenge focusing on indigenous women. So the question is, indigenous food systems for women have traditionally been thought as healthy, but we know that these populations are also suffering malnutrition. So what are the actions that are necessary in order to contribute to the health and the empowering of the indigenous women?
Thank you, Maro. It's good that the public has mentioned this issue of intersectorials and the situation of indigenous women because uh, th that those are groups in our region within this diversity of women that we have been discussing here that are experiencing an additional discrimination as a result of their of them belonging to a specific ethnic group. The issue of food and its link with the indigenous world has to do with cultural relevance. With Catalina, we always talk about that issue because it's an issue that is very attractive for us. So there are two things that I would like to highlight here. One, when we design public policies, we must observe that cultural relevance with regards food intake, and we must also observe aspects that are fundamental, such as how that food system that is underway in a location in an indigenous community is including or excluding women from production systems. And what is a key factor here is the analysis of value chains, because in that analysis of value chains, there is a fundamental aspect, and that is to rescue traditional knowledge, the traditional knowledge of our people. And women historically have been the depositories of all this information, of all this culinary culture, which is ancestral in nature, and that we must bring to the forefront. And indeed, it has been proved by different research and studies that much of the traditional indigenous food is food that has certain balances that relate precisely to that cultural relevance. And Lorena, who is a doctor, um, she and Catalina also works with as an anthropologist in this. But these are aspects that we have to take into consideration. On the one hand, we cannot simply talk about the responsibility of women for food in families, and that is very clear. And this is something experienced also by indigenous women with a double burden, because the impact, for example, of industrialization, that type of food, when it reaches the private sphere, as mentioned by Carolina, and it is, and that way of eating, that approach to food becomes much more industrialized and so on, much more than those that are relevant to its culture. Women are also um, made responsible responsible for that. So within that framework, the situation of indigenous women, of Afro women, losing our own roots. We need to rescue a large amount of ancestral knowledge. Um, and this has to do with the biodiversity of our planet. One of the issues that is one of our biggest concerns with regards to climate change. There, for example, we find women that produce some honey. In Mexico, there is an ethnic group that produces a type of honey, and they care for a specific type of bee that is unique in the world. In Peru, we find that same thing with cocoa. And we have researched this, but we still need a long way to go because the issue of biodiversity is something that is also of interest to us because of its relationship with ethnical aspects. And these are the issues that must come to the fore because indigenous women are also experiencing these problems that we're discussing here. But in addition to that, with an intervention of that food system, and that has to do with the cultural relevance of its food. So this is as far as I would like to go. And of course, if others want to add something else, please go ahead. Thank you, Claudia. Well, just before we conclude, I think it would be interesting to listen to our four guests from abroad, a final remark or an invitation that Claudia has made. I don't know, Carolina, whether you would like to take a couple of minutes to mention something to conclude. After that, Maria Clara, Lorena, and Guadalupe will also be able to say some final words. I would like to thank everyone. I began by saying that food, which is something such a daily activity, is something that we should discuss and debate. Academia has been very reticent when it comes to discussing these issues, and likewise states. I believe that to think in community terms, to generate shared epistemology and shared knowledge around these issues is something very interesting. And I'd like to thank you all for having had the chance to meet here and to listen to all our questions. Um, One is often works at a very individual level and forgets the relationship that is extremely necessary with the macro level, so to speak. And so I just like to say that these issues have to be debated and that I'm very happy to belong to a very small epistemological community, albeit at a partial level today. Thank you, Carolina. Maria Clara, please go ahead. I'll be very brief. I'd like to once again thank the organizers of this event. I feel that all the issues that we have discussed are extremely important and especially open this dialogue with people from very different backgrounds and from very different fields. I believe that it is fundamental to understand food systems and all issues related to food because food involves social aspects, biological aspects, different types of aspects, and to be able to understand this holistically at a global level, what is fundamental is to have this perspective as from different spheres of knowledge and disciplines. So I believe that this is a very positive aspect of this event that we have had today. And once again, I'd like to thank Catalina and Claudia for wanting to add and incorporate into this vision of the relationship with the body when we talk about food systems, because I believe that this is a fundamental notion. Um, so I'd like to thank you all because I believe that this is very important. Thank you very much. That's all from me. Thank you, Maria Clara. Lorena, you have the floor. Well, I would also like to express my gratitude. Um, I would just like to add that it has been an honor to be here with people that are experts on this issue. I'm not an expert expert on this. I like all food-related aspects, and there we have met with Claudia, Carolina, Catalina. So it's been a pleasure to meet Guadalupe, Maria Clara, and thank you, Manuela, for acting as a moderator. Perhaps I would just like to say, as a final remark, I would like to highlight the relevance of understanding these issues and of translating these issues into structural public policies. And I insist on this because when one analyzes the causes of this discrimination, social determinants are common conductors to all these aspects that I referred to during my first presentation. Inequality is one of them. And I believe that we have to be very courageous in order to uh, put forward public policies that are not easy. These are not public policies that involve summoning kindly people to eat healthily and so on. Often these policies imply regulations, imply laws, imply standards, rules, which at the end of the day means that these issues, in one way or another, are indeed implemented. I believe that this is necessary. We cannot continue to wait. And as from the academic world where I work at present, and in an alliance with international entities such as the FAO, we should be able to exert influence on public policymakers, providing arguments, evidence, justifications, and a diagnosis so that they may have sufficient elements in order to respond with the strength and the courage that is required with policies that are not always viewed as very amicable to all sectors. So thank you very much, everyone, and hopefully we will be able to continue to discuss and cooperate around this very important issue.
Well, thank you, Lorena. It's very important also to highlight the partnership with FAO and all the different social actors and stakeholders, private sector, legislators. These dialogues are being followed by many people through the social media, and I hope that that can contribute. My dear Guadalupe, you are our ambassador. Please go ahead. We can hear you. Yes, thank you. Well, one of the effects of COVID-19, of this pandemic, which is hurting the world, is precisely that we need to rethink the economic models and we need to rethink the models of the food systems that we currently have so that we can have a better world. We have to build a better world in which the right to food is a right for everybody. That is an ethical, unnegotiable, and inevitable also right. We do run the risk of not only having a health related impact, but also a hunger related impact because of everything implied by closed countries, closed economies, the number of people that are unemployed, but also the burden that that implies for women, as we have already seen in the different panels and presentations. So that political willingness of the legislators and governments has got to translate into legal framework that create or that address this inequality to have a better redistribution so that the wealth and richness that our countries have should really contribute for people to live with dignity and they have the right to a healthy life. I think that is the commitment that we should all undertake. We have to build those legal frameworks and those public policies in order to guarantee the right to food so that it can be demanded by the citizens everywhere in the world and in our region. That is what we want to do, and that's how we want to contribute. And we have to do this together. We have to bring different willingness together so that we can establish these strategic alliances. Well, thank you so much, Guadalupe, and the rest of the members of the panel for this wonderful exchange of opinions. I believe that many topics were addressed here, and there's a lot of work that we have to do make from now on. Maybe we can highlight some important or key ideas. When you talked about the gaps, you talked about poverty. Poverty also related to time of rural women and the challenges that they face. Also, the fact that this inequality of rural women is invisible. Many of you talked about this, and when you talked about the role of the members of parliament to trying to position these topics, that's precisely what we're talking about, moving away from being invisible and making their issues visible and clear for all the stakeholders, also within different households. I liked it when Carolina said that the gender inequality really does not benefit anyone. This just goes to highlight that this is a challenge for everyone, men and women, and therefore we need to work together because equality does benefit all of us. I think that that is something that's very important to mention. Also, you mentioned the importance of working with a very broad perspective and not only from the biomedical approach. I think that that's interesting when you talked about obesity, the importance of different social actors, economic actors. I think that that's quite important. Also, you talked about applying a feminist approach to make this effective. I think that that is quite powerful. In a panel like this one, we can say and we can present these topics. That's precisely what we're here for. When it comes to legislation, I think it was very important to highlight again the importance of the laws that need to be put together, but also those that need to be eliminated. Discriminatory laws within a patriarchal framework that comes from decades. That's quite important. And it's also somehow related to us being invisible. Some of these laws impact us, and we need to work in trying to get rid of modifying some of them. And for this, we require this commitment that was mentioned by Claudia from the legislative point of view, establishing these alliances and partnerships, investing in leadership and training. A catalog of rights was also mentioned. I like that a lot because human rights are all related. So when you mentioned as many of the rights, precisely I was thinking about human rights. And in order to have a dignified life, we have to consider all of the rights, not just some of them individually. And I also think that it is extremely important that food and healthy eating should be a right, not a privilege. And for this, we need to help in contribute in order to overcome some of these gaps. So with these huge challenges that we have before us, I want to thank you all, everybody that saw us through the social media, the people that asked questions and that participated in this dialogue, and the invitation is open to continue working for the rights of rural women. Rural women have rights, and we're working to transform the food systems. Thank you, everybody. Have a great and good afternoon.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Chao, chao. Listo,
Gracias.
chicas, perfecto, como siempre.
Adiós, un gusto.
Hasta luego, un abrazo.
Muchas
Gracias a
gracias.
Que estén
todas.
bien. Chao.